How does a democracy die? Not always with a battle, not always with a coup at the barrel of a gun, but sometimes through the slow, calculated dismantling of every institution designed to stop one man from seizing everything. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was handed the chancellorship of Germany through what appeared, on the surface, to be a perfectly legal political transaction. A deal made in a private villa. A handshake between old men who thought they could use a useful fanatic and discard him when they were done. Within 20 months, those same men would be dead, imprisoned, or cowering in silence. And Hitler would hold more concentrated power than any German leader since the medieval Kaisers. The story of how that happened, how a democracy was murdered from within, step by meticulous step, between January 1933 and August 1934, is one of the most terrifying and consequential political transformations in human history. And what makes it truly chilling is that almost every move was made to look completely legal. In this video, we will find out exactly what made Hitler untouchable. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. To understand how Hitler became untouchable, you first have to understand how broken the world he inherited truly was. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation in freefall. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919 from the ashes of the First World War and the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, had never truly found its footing. Born under the shadow of the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, which stripped Germany of territory, imposed ruinous reparations, and placed the entire blame for the war on German shoulders, the Republic was despised from its very first breath by the nationalists who branded it a system of betrayal. They called it the November Criminals government, a stab in the back by socialists and Jews who had supposedly surrendered a war Germany could still have won. It was a lie, but it was an enormously powerful one, and it poisoned German political life for over a decade. The Weimar Republic's constitutional structure was, in many ways, its own undoing. Proportional representation meant that the German parliament, the Reichstag, was perpetually fragmented among dozens of competing parties, making stable majority governments nearly impossible to sustain. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany cycled through 20 separate coalition governments. None lasted long. None could build the kind of consensus needed to address the nation's mounting crises. And the crises were real and enormous. The hyperinflation of 1923 had wiped out the savings of an entire middle class. People had literally burned banknotes in their furnaces because they were cheaper than firewood. By the time economic stability returned in the mid-1920s, memories of that catastrophe had seared themselves into the German national consciousness. And then, in October 1929, came the Wall Street crash and the global Great Depression that followed. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were unemployed, roughly a third of the entire workforce. Families queued in breadlines, veterans begged on street corners. The middle classes who had finally rebuilt something from the ruins of hyperinflation watched it crumble again, and they were furious. Into this desperation stepped Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. Hitler was not, in 1933, a newcomer. He had been agitating in German politics since the early 1920s, had attempted and failed to seize power by force during the disastrous Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, had served 9 months in Landsberg prison, during which he dictated Mein Kampf, and had spent the following years rebuilding the Nazi Party into a formidable political machine. The Nazis offered something that none of the established parties could quite match: absolute certainty. While the Democrats and the Socialists argued and compromised and failed, the Nazis promised a simple, powerful narrative. Germany had been betrayed, Germany would be restored, and Adolf Hitler was the man who would do it. The rallies, the uniforms, the choreographed pageantry of the Nuremberg gatherings, all of it was designed to project strength and inevitability. In a country exhausted by chaos, that was a potent message. The Nazi Party's electoral rise was dramatic. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, the NSDAP had received just 2.6% of the vote. A fringe movement. By July 1932, as armed, the Depression reached its worst. They captured 37.4% of the vote, making them by far the largest single party in the Reichstag. But here is the critical detail that is often misunderstood. The Nazis never won an outright majority, not once. Even at their electoral peak, 3 out of 5 German voters chose someone else. Hitler did not simply ride a wave of popular enthusiasm into power. He was placed there by a small group of conservative politicians who made a catastrophic miscalculation, an understanding that miscalculation is the first key to understanding how he became untouchable. The man at the center of that miscalculation was Franz von Papen, a slick, charming, well-connected former cavalry officer and diplomat who briefly served as Germany's chancellor from June to December 1932. Von Papen was everything Hitler was not. Aristocratic, polished, comfortable in elite drawing rooms, a member of the old German establishment through and through. He had none of Hitler's mass appeal, but fancied himself a political genius. And he had a plan. By late 1932, Germany was on the edge of collapse. The Nazis had lost ground in the November 1932 elections, falling from 37% to 33% of the vote, and some analysts believed the Nazi surge might be cresting. Hitler himself was in a dark, impatient mood, threatening to withdraw from politics altogether if he was not given the chancellorship. Von Papen, having just been ousted from the chancellorship himself by the formidable General Kurt von Schleicher, was consumed by a desire for revenge and a return to influence. He proposed a deal to President Paul von Hindenburg. Hitler would be named chancellor, but the cabinet would be packed with conservative nationalists who would control and contain him. Von Papen himself would serve as vice-chancellor, effectively running the government from behind the scenes. Hitler, they reasoned, would be a figurehead, a useful populist, a tool they could direct and eventually discard. "In 2 months," von Papen boasted to a friend, "we will have pushed Hitler into a corner so hard that he'll squeak." Paul von Hindenburg, the 85-year-old field marshal and president of Germany, was a man of towering military reputation but limited political vision. He had long despised Hitler, once refusing even to meet him and dismissing him as merely fit to be a postmaster. For months, Hindenburg resisted pressure to appoint Hitler as chancellor, but by January 1933, with the political crisis deepening, with his own political allies urging the move, and with von Papen whispering in his ear that the Nazis could be controlled, Hindenburg relented. On January 30th, 1933, in a brief businesslike ceremony in the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. He was 43 years old. He had never held public office before in his life. The conservatives around him were certain they had the situation well in hand. They could not have been more wrong. The moment Hitler took the chancellorship, the speed of what followed was breathtaking. His first goal was not to appear revolutionary at all. He wanted nothing so much as to be perceived as a normal, constitutional German chancellor, for now. He called for new elections to be held on March 5, 1933, arguing that he needed a fresh mandate from the German people. The Reichstag, dominated by no single majority, agreed. The election campaign that followed was anything but normal. The Nazi Party had its hands on the levers of state power for the first time. Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's most senior lieutenants, had been appointed Reich Commissioner of the Prussian Interior Ministry, which gave him effective control of the Prussian police, and Prussia contained more than half of Germany's total population. Göring immediately dismissed hundreds of police officers suspected of Republican or socialist sympathies and replaced them with Nazi loyalists and SA stormtroopers deputized as auxiliary police. The message was clear from the very beginning. The institutions of the state would be bent to serve the Nazi Party, not the other way around. The Nazi electoral campaign of February 1933 was also something new in German politics, a campaign conducted with the resources of the state itself. Joseph Goebbels, who would soon be named Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, coordinated a media blitz unlike anything Germany had seen. Radio stations broadcast Hitler's speeches. Nazi-aligned newspapers flooded the country. Rallies were held in every major city, torchlit and spectacular, projecting an image of an unstoppable movement. Meanwhile, the SA stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, Hitler's brown-shirted paramilitary force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, roamed the streets attacking political opponents, breaking up socialist and communist meetings and creating an atmosphere of intimidation and barely controlled violence. When political opponents tried to hold their own rallies, they were often broken up by force. Communist Party headquarters were raided, Social Democratic Party offices were vandalized. The message sent to ordinary Germans was unmistakable. Opposing the Nazis now carried serious physical risk. And then, on the evening of February 27, 1933, everything changed. At around 9 o'clock that night, a fire broke out in the Reichstag building, the seat of the German parliament. Flames quickly engulfed the great glass-domed chamber, and by the time firefighters brought the blaze under control, the magnificent building was a gutted shell. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was caught inside the burning building, matches in his pocket, and immediately arrested. He would confess to setting the fire alone and would be executed the following January. Whether he acted entirely alone, whether Nazi agents helped him or even set the fire themselves in a deliberate provocation, remains debated by historians to this day. But what is not debated at all is what happened in the hours and days that followed, because Adolf Hitler could not have scripted a more perfect crisis if he had tried. Hitler arrived at the burning Reichstag that night with Hermann Göring and other senior officials. Witnesses reported that he was animated, almost exhilarated, describing it as a sign from God. "This is the beginning of the communist revolution," he declared. "Not a moment must be lost." By the following morning, he had what he wanted, a justification for the most sweeping emergency decree in German history. President Hindenburg, old, confused, and surrounded by advisors urging him to act decisively against the communist threat, signed what became known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, officially the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State, on February 28, 1933. It was 4 pages long, and it suspended, indefinitely, most of the fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. The right to personal liberty was suspended, freedom of expression was suspended, freedom of the press was suspended, the right to free assembly was suspended, the secrecy of postal and telephone communications was suspended. The rights of individual German states against interference from the central government were suspended. The decree also authorized the death penalty for a range of offences, including arson, sabotage, and attacks on government officials. All of this was done under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, an emergency provision that had been intended to allow rapid government action in genuine national crises. In a single signature from an aging president, the constitutional order of Germany was dismantled. The arrests began within hours. In the first few days after the decree, the SA and the police swept through Germany, rounding up thousands of communists, socialists, trade union leaders, journalists, and political opponents of every description. The Communist Party was effectively banned from participating in the coming election. Its leading officials were arrested wherever they could be found. An estimated 10,000 people were taken into protective custody, a term that, in the Nazi vocabulary, meant imprisonment without charge, without trial, and without any clear end date. Emergency detention centres were set up in warehouses, factories, and SA barracks. These were the first improvised concentration camps, precursors to the horror that would follow. The violence that the stormtroopers had previously conducted with a wink and a nod from authorities now had the full force of emergency law behind it. The March 5, 1933 elections took place in this atmosphere of fear, intimidation, and suppressed opposition. The results were significant, but not what Hitler had hoped for. Despite everything, despite the resources of the state, the Reichstag fire, the massive propaganda campaign, the suppression of communist political activity, the Nazis won only 43.9% of the vote. Add in their coalition partner, the German National People's Party, with 8%, and they had a working majority, but the Nazis alone could not claim the people's overwhelming mandate that Hitler desired. Nearly 43% of Germans had voted for parties other than the Nazis, even in these circumstances. The Social Democrats, despite having their leaders arrested and their offices raided, still managed to receive over 7 million votes. It was a remarkable act of resistance under extraordinary pressure. But Hitler needed more than a simple parliamentary majority for his next move. He needed a supermajority, 2/3 of the Reichstag, to pass the law he was planning, a law that would effectively render the Reichstag itself superfluous. That law was the Enabling Act, and the manoeuvring required to pass it represents one of the most dramatic moments of constitutional destruction in the entire history of modern democracy. The Enabling Act, formerly titled the Law to Remedy the Distress of People and Reich, was deceptively simple in its language, but absolute in its implications. It would give the Reich Cabinet, meaning Hitler's government, the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag for a period of 4 years. Those laws could even deviate from the Weimar Constitution itself. In practical terms, it meant that Hitler would have the power to rule by decree, with no meaningful legislative check on his authority. He would no longer need to go to Parliament for anything. He would be, in all but formal title, a dictator. To pass it, he needed the votes of 2/3 of Reichstag members, meaning that beyond his coalition majority, he needed support from at least some of the Catholic Centre Party, the major remaining non-socialist parliamentary force. The session that debated the Enabling Act was held on March 23, 1933, at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, since the Reichstag building itself was still a burned ruin. The setting was designed for maximum intimidation. Outside the Opera House, SA stormtroopers and SS men lined the streets in their tens of thousands, chanting slogans and making clear through their presence exactly what the consequences of a no vote might be. Inside, the deputies themselves had to push their way through ranks of uniformed men to reach their seats. The galleries were packed with Nazi supporters. The atmosphere was one of barely contained menace. Hitler gave a speech that mixed threats with promises, warnings with assurances. He told the assembled deputies that the government would use the Enabling Act with restraint, that the rights of the churches would be respected, that the president's powers would be unaffected, that the position of the states would not be fundamentally altered. He promised that the 4-year authorization would not be renewed if it proved unnecessary. Almost every one of these assurances was a lie, and many of the men listening to him knew it or suspected it. But knowing and being willing to act on that knowledge are very different things when the alternative is confrontation with an organized, violent, and newly empowered political machine. One man stood up and made clear exactly what he thought. Otto Wels, the chairman of the Social Democratic Party, rose to speak in opposition to the Enabling Act at a moment of extraordinary personal courage, with SA men ringing the building, with many of his colleagues already under arrest or in hiding, with the explicit knowledge that his party was the last organised political force left to vote no. Wels delivered a quiet, dignified speech defending the principles of democratic government. He said that the Social Democrats would vote against the act, that no enabling act could give the government the right to destroy ideas that were eternal and indestructible. "We greet the persecuted and the hard-pressed," he said. "We greet our friends in the Reich. Their steadfastness and loyalty deserve admiration. The courage of their convictions, their unbroken confidence, guarantee a brighter future." Hitler replied with fury, furious precisely because a quiet, dignified opposition was more threatening to his narrative than violence would have been. He told Wels that he did not need the Social Democrats' votes and that Germany's star would rise whether they wanted it to or not. The vote was held. The Social Democrats, all 94 of them present, voted no. Every other party, including the Catholic Centre Party, whose support Hitler had secured through personal assurances and behind-the-scenes negotiations, voted yes. The final tally was 441 in favour, 84 against. The Enabling Act passed. German parliamentary democracy, as a meaningful check on executive power, was dead. It had voted itself out of existence. What made the Enabling Act such a decisive moment was not just the transfer of legislative power, but the psychological shift it represented. Every barrier that the established parties might have thrown up against Hitler's ambitions had now been cleared away by those very parties themselves. The Centre Party, the Conservatives, the Nationalists, all of them had decided that accommodation was better than resistance, that a managed relationship with the new government was safer than confrontation. They had miscalculated on a historic scale, and they would have almost no opportunity to correct that mistake. With the Enabling Act in hand, the pace of the Nazi seizure of total power accelerated dramatically. In the weeks and months that followed, a process that historians call Gleichschaltung, roughly translated as coordination or bringing into line, was applied systematically to virtually every institution in German public life. Trade unions were the first major target after the political parties. On May 1, 1933, Hitler's government staged a spectacular celebration of National Labour Day, a holiday that had traditionally belonged to the socialist labour movement. It was a masterpiece of appropriation. The workers were celebrated, speeches were made about the dignity of German labour, and thousands attended rallies and parades. The following day, May 2nd, SA and SS units seized trade union offices across Germany. Union funds were seized. Union leaders were arrested, beaten, and in some cases, killed. Within a single day, the entire independent labour movement that had taken decades to build was destroyed. A Nazi-controlled organization, the German Labour Front, was established to replace it. Workers would still be organized, but they would be organized under the absolute authority of the Nazi state, with no right to strike and no mechanism for genuine collective bargaining. The political parties followed in rapid succession. In late May, the Social Democratic Party was banned and its assets confiscated. Its leaders were arrested or fled into exile. The other major parties, the Conservatives, the Nationalists, the Liberals, dissolved themselves one by one throughout June and July 1933, some under direct pressure, others in a kind of preemptive capitulation that they imagined might earn them favourable treatment. The German National People's Party, the conservative nationalist partner that had helped put Hitler in power in the first place, dissolved itself on June 27th. On July 14, 1933, the law against the formation of new parties was enacted. It declared the NSDAP the only legal political party in Germany and made the formation of any new party a criminal offence punishable by imprisonment. Germany had become a one-party state in less than 6 months. In this video, we'll keep exploring the mechanisms by which Hitler made himself absolutely untouchable, because the parties were only the beginning. The individual German states presented another potential check on Hitler's power, and they were dealt with swiftly and thoroughly. Germany under the Weimar Republic had been a federal system in which the individual states, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony and others, retained meaningful political autonomy with their own governments, police forces and administrative structures. Hitler recognized immediately that these autonomous power centers could become refugees for opposition or focal points for resistance. The process of bringing the states into line began even before the Enabling Act was passed. In late February and early March 1933, Nazi-affiliated governments had been imposed on several states through a combination of SA pressure, emergency decrees, and outright thuggery. By March 31st, a law was passed that dissolved all state parliaments and ordered them reconstituted in proportion to the March 5th national election results, which of course guaranteed Nazi dominance. A second law, passed on April 7th, created the position of Reichsstatthalter, Reich governors, who were appointed by Hitler himself to oversee each state government. The states were not abolished, but they were rendered powerless. Their autonomy was an illusion maintained for appearances. The Reichsstatthalter held the real authority and they answered directly to the Führer. By January 1934, a further law formally transferred the sovereign powers of the German states to the Reich central government, completing the destruction of German federalism. The control of information was equally essential, and no single person was more responsible for that control than Joseph Goebbels. Born in 1897 in Reit in the Rhineland, Goebbels was a small, dark-haired man with a club foot that had exempted him from military service in the First World War. He had a doctorate in philology from Heidelberg University and was, in his way, genuinely gifted. A brilliant writer, an electrifying public speaker, and a propagandist of extraordinary instinct and ruthlessness. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1924 and risen through its ranks to become the party's propaganda chief in 1930, responsible for the theatrical staging of Nazi rallies and the psychological sophistication of Nazi messaging. When Hitler became Chancellor, Goebbels' reward came on March 13, 1933, when he was appointed Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, a title that told you everything you needed to know about what the ministry was designed to do. The Enlightenment in question was the replacement of free thought with state-approved ideology. Goebbels moved with breathtaking speed to bring Germany's entire media landscape under Nazi control. In April 1933, the Reich Press Chamber was established, followed by equivalent chambers for radio, film, theatre, music, fine arts and literature. Membership in the relevant chamber was mandatory for any professional working in those fields, and membership could be refused or revoked on political or racial grounds. Jewish journalists, editors, filmmakers and musicians were expelled from their professions in a single bureaucratic stroke. Politically unreliable Germans faced the same fate. Within months, the German press, which had been one of the most vibrant and diverse in the world, was transformed into an instrument of state propaganda. Newspaper editors operated under a new law that made them personally responsible for the political content of their publications, which in practice meant that any editor who published something displeasing to the government faced criminal prosecution. Editors naturally chose safety over truth. Radio was, in Goebbels' judgment, even more important than the press, and he devoted enormous energy to controlling and deploying it. In 1933, roughly 4 million German households had radios, a large number, but still a minority. Goebbels launched an initiative to make radio accessible to every German family. The Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, was a simple, cheap radio set manufactured under government supervision and priced low enough that almost anyone could afford one. By 1939, over 70% of German households would own one. Public loudspeakers were installed in streets, restaurants, factories, and offices so that Hitler's speeches could reach Germans who had no radio at home. For the first time in history, a political leader could speak directly into the living rooms of an entire nation simultaneously. And the message would be his alone. All independent radio stations had been nationalized in 1933, and from that point on, German airwaves carried only content approved by the Reich Ministry. The burning of books in May 1933 was perhaps the most publicly symbolic act of cultural destruction. On the evening of May 10, 1933, in a scene that shocked the world, university students allied with the Nazi Student Union carried tens of thousands of books from libraries and bookshops to bonfires in public squares in 30 German university cities. The books burned that night included the works of Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Heinrich Heine, Erich Maria Remarque, Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Tucholsky, and hundreds of other Jewish, socialist, pacifist, or otherwise un-German authors. As the flames rose into the night sky, Goebbels addressed the crowd in Berlin, declaring that the era of extreme Jewish intellectualism was at an end and that the German soul could again express itself. Heinrich Heine, the great German Jewish poet whose books were among those burning, had written a century earlier, with terrible prescience, "Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also." The men lighting those fires in 1933 would prove him right within a decade. But controlling the media, banning parties, bringing the states into line, all of this required an instrument of terror to enforce compliance. That instrument already existed in two forms, the SA and the SS. The Sturmabteilung, the SA, had been the Nazi Party's paramilitary force since the early 1920s. By 1933, it numbered somewhere between 2 and 3 million men. A private army larger than the German Reichswehr, the official national military, which was restricted to 100,000 men under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The SA stormtroopers were Hitler's shock troops, the muscle that had broken up political meetings, intimidated voters, and beaten opponents in the streets throughout the years of struggle. Their leader was Ernst Röhm, one of Hitler's oldest and most loyal comrades, a barrel-chested, hard-drinking, openly homosexual veteran who had known Hitler since the earliest days of the movement, and who spoke to the Führer with a directness that few others dared. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, had originally been a much smaller bodyguard formation, technically subordinate to the SA. But under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, appointed Reichsführer SS in 1929, it had grown into something far more formidable and disciplined. Himmler was everything Rome was not: precise, bureaucratic, methodical, obsessively ideological, and utterly without personal warmth. He was a former agricultural student who had a near-mystical belief in Germanic racial destiny and an organizational genius that expressed itself in meticulous file-keeping, rigid hierarchy, and the building of institutions. While the SA was a mass movement of street fighters who liked to brawl and drink, the SS was Himmler's elite within the elite, selected on criteria of physical appearance, racial ancestry, and absolute personal loyalty to Hitler. By 1933, the SS numbered around 50,000 men, still much smaller than the SA, but far more reliable and far more dangerous. Would these two paramilitary forces, one massive and unruly, one small and disciplined, come into conflict? That question would define the most dramatic moment of Hitler's consolidation of power, but that story belongs to the summer of 1934. Before we get there, we need to understand the men who were supposed to provide legal cover for everything that was happening. The legal system of Germany was another institution that needed to be bent to Hitler's will, and bending it proved disturbingly easy. German lawyers and judges had a strong tradition of professional pride and strict formalism, a reverence for procedure and precedent that might, in theory, have made them a natural bulwark against arbitrary power. In practice, many of them were ideologically sympathetic to nationalism and conservative authoritarianism, hostile to the left and susceptible to the argument that the new regime represented not a break from legality, but a higher, more authentic form of national law. The Reich Ministry of Justice moved quickly to purge Jewish and politically unreliable judges and lawyers from their posts, and the German legal profession's official organizations, its bar associations and judges' associations, voluntarily dissolved themselves and reconstituted as Nazi-controlled entities with barely a murmur of protest. The People's Court, the Volksgerichtshof, was established in April 1934 specifically to try political cases involving charges of treason, and its judges were selected on the basis of their political reliability rather than their legal expertise. It was not a court of law in any meaningful sense. It was a mechanism for judicial murder, rubber-stamping sentences that had already been decided by political masters. Rudolf Diels was one of those fascinating figures who appear at the hinge points of history, men who are neither heroes nor villains in any simple sense, but who embody perfectly the moral confusion of an era. A career civil servant in the Prussian police, Diels was shrewd, ambitious, cynical, and possessed of a face that appeared to have been carved from leather, crisscrossed with dueling scars that gave him an appropriately sinister appearance. In April 1933, Hermann Göring appointed Diels as the first head of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state, police, which would shortly become known to the world by its terrifying abbreviation, the Gestapo. Diels was not a fanatical true believer. He was a pragmatist who recognized which way the wind was blowing and positioned himself accordingly. Under his leadership, the Gestapo began its work of monitoring, infiltrating, arresting, and disappearing the political opponents of the regime. The Gestapo operated outside the normal legal constraints that bound the regular police. Its decisions could not be reviewed by courts. Its arrests required no formal charges. Its detainees could be held indefinitely. It was, in its founding conception, a machine for the extrajudicial enforcement of political conformity, and it proved horrifyingly effective. What the Gestapo represented in structural terms was something genuinely new in German history: the complete fusion of the security apparatus with the political apparatus. In the Weimar Republic, the police had been, at least in principle, a neutral instrument of law enforcement serving the state rather than the party. Under the Nazis, that distinction was obliterated. The state was the party, and the party was the state, and the security forces existed to serve the ideological and political needs of the movement that had captured the state. The Gestapo's files grew with remarkable speed. Informers, voluntary ones, it should be noted, since the Gestapo relied far more heavily on civilian denunciation than on professional agents, reported on their neighbours, colleagues, relatives, and acquaintances. A grumbled joke at a dinner table, an overheard criticism of the Führer, a hesitation in giving the Hitler salute. All of these could result in a knock on the door in the middle of the night. The chilling genius of the system was that it required relatively few actual Gestapo agents to maintain control over millions of people, because the people policed each other, motivated by a mixture of ideological commitment, personal grievances, careerist opportunism, and simple fear. How, you might ask, did ordinary Germans respond to the disappearance of their neighbours and colleagues? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. Some were genuinely horrified and some resisted, though often at great personal cost. But many more accommodated themselves to the new reality with a speed that disturbs the historical observer. The reasons are multiple. For some, the targets of the early terror, communists, socialists, Jews, political opponents of the right, were people they had no particular sympathy for. The regime was careful, in its early months, to focus its violence on those who could be portrayed as enemies of the people, enemies of Germany, enemies of the national recovery that most Germans desperately desired. The concentration camps of 1933 and 1934, places like Dachau near Munich or Oranienburg near Berlin, were widely reported in the German press as places where communists and other criminals were being re-educated and made useful to society. The euphemisms were absurd but widely accepted by people who preferred not to look too closely. And crucially, the economic situation was genuinely improving. Unemployment was falling, roads were being built, Germany was rearming and regaining international respect, or so it seemed. Hitler was delivering what he had promised in terms of national renewal, and this made it psychologically easier for many Germans to overlook, rationalize, or simply not think about what was happening to those who didn't fit into the new national community. The churches presented a more complicated problem for Hitler's ambitions. Germany in 1933 was a deeply religious country, divided roughly 60% Protestant and 40% Catholic. Both churches had long institutional histories, dense organizational networks reaching into every village and neighborhood, and a claim on the loyalties of millions of Germans that predated and potentially competed with the loyalties demanded by the Nazi state. Hitler himself was raised Catholic, but had long since abandoned genuine religious belief, privately expressing contempt for Christianity, while publicly presenting himself as a defender of Christian civilization against godless communism. His strategy toward the churches in 1933 was one of strategic accommodation, presenting a friendly face while gradually working to reduce the church's social influence and, where possible, bring them under state control. The Protestant churches were more vulnerable to this approach. German Protestantism had always had a closer relationship with German nationalism than Catholicism, and there was a substantial pro-Nazi movement within Protestant ranks known as the German Christians, who wanted to create a national Reich Church fully aligned with National Socialist ideology. In May 1933, Hitler supported the appointment of Ludwig Müller, a mediocre army chaplain but devoted Nazi, as Reich Bishop, the head of a unified German evangelical church. But the German Christians' attempt to Aryanize Protestantism, including proposals to remove the Old Testament from Christian scripture on the grounds that it was Jewish, provoked a powerful counter-reaction. In September 1933, a coalition of theologically conservative pastors formed the Pastors' Emergency League under Martin Niemöller, a decorated submarine commander from the First World War who had subsequently become a pastor. The Pastors' Emergency League eventually evolved into the Confessing Church, which rejected state interference in theological matters and maintained that the Church answered to God's law rather than German national law. Niemöller himself would eventually be arrested in 1937 and spend the remainder of the Nazi years as Hitler's personal prisoner in Sachsenhausen and Dachau concentration camps. But in 1933 and 1934, the Confessing Church represented one of the few organized sites of principled resistance to Nazi totalitarianism within Germany. A fact that made Hitler furious and which he filed away for future punishment. With the Catholic Church, Hitler chose a different approach. In July 1933, the Nazi government signed a concordat with the Vatican, a formal treaty negotiated with Pope Pius XI's Secretary of State, the future Pope Pius XII, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. The Concordat guaranteed the freedom of Catholic education and the independence of Catholic institutions in Germany in exchange for the Catholic Church's withdrawal from German political life. The Centre Party, which had been the primary Catholic political force and whose dissolution had already been accomplished in practice, was formally ended as part of the arrangement. The Vatican believed it had protected the institutional church from Nazi attack. Hitler believed he had neutralized organized Catholic political opposition. In the short term, both were partially right. The Concordat did provide a degree of protection for Catholic schools and parishes, but it also provided the Nazi regime with a major propaganda coup, a treaty with the oldest and most prestigious institution in the world that implicitly legitimized the new German government. The bishops who had urged Catholic voters to consider whether the Nazi program was compatible with their faith now fell silent on political questions, bound by an agreement that they had hoped would protect their flock, but which in practice largely protected the Nazi government from Catholic opposition. Big business in Germany in 1933 was in many ways the most cynical actor in the drama of Hitler's rise. German industrial capitalism had always been suspicious of Weimar democracy, which had given organized labor considerable political power and imposed social welfare costs that industrialists found burdensome. When the Depression came, industrialists and financiers became even more desperate for political solutions that would reduce labor costs, break the power of the unions, and provide a stable, business-friendly political framework. Hitler offered all of this. In February 1933, just days after taking the chancellorship, Hitler held a secret meeting with some of Germany's most powerful industrialists at Hermann Göring's official residence. He told them that Germany stood at a turning point. Either the communist alternative or the nationalist alternative. Private enterprise could only survive under a strong nationalist government, and elections, real democratic elections, were a threat to everything they valued. Hitler was asking for money, and the industrialists from Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach to Georg von Schnitzler of E.G. Farben opened their checkbooks. 3 million Reichsmarks flowed into Nazi party coffers within days, funding the final phase of the March 1933 election campaign. The businessmen who funded that campaign were not naive simpletons. They knew what they were enabling. They calculated that they could benefit from the destruction of labor organization and the suppression of the left, while managing and moderating Hitler's more extreme tendencies. Like the conservative politicians, they were wrong. When the trade unions were destroyed on May 2, 1933, the industrialists were delighted. When collective bargaining was abolished, they were relieved. When Jewish business competitors were subject to boycotts, discrimination, and eventually forced sale of their assets, the Aryanization of Jewish-owned businesses that would accelerate through the 1930s, some German businessmen saw commercial opportunity rather than moral catastrophe. The collaboration of German big business with the Nazi regime was not a forced marriage. It was a willing partnership, at least in its early years, and that willing partnership provided the regime with crucial economic resources and legitimacy. Germany's dramatic economic recovery in 1933 and 1934, as unemployment fell and the economy visibly improved, was in part the result of massive state investment in public works and rearmament. Projects that required the cooperation of German industry, and that industry was happy to provide, especially since the workers could no longer strike for better wages. Now, something was brewing within the Nazi movement itself that would produce the most violent and decisive act of Hitler's consolidation of power. The problem was Ernst Röhm and the SA. By the spring of 1934, the relationship between Hitler and his old friend had become critically strained. Röhm had been dreaming of a true National Socialist revolution that would go beyond the merely political, that would upend the social and military order of Germany and create something genuinely new. He wanted the SA, with its millions of men, to become the foundation of a new German People's Army, a revolutionary militia that would absorb and replace the traditional Reichswehr, the professional army of the old Prussian officer class. He called for a second revolution that would destroy the old elites who had survived the political changes of 1933 with their wealth and social position largely intact. This was not just an abstract vision. Röhm had been conducting formal negotiations with Wehrmacht officers about the incorporation of the SA into the military structure, positioning himself as the natural commander of a future merged force. The implications of Röhm's ambitions were deeply alarming to multiple power centers simultaneously. The Wehrmacht's officer corps despised and feared the SA. They were professional soldiers of traditional military bearing who regarded the SA stormtroopers as undisciplined street brawlers and whose concept of military honor was bound up with the Prussian officer tradition that Röhm wanted to abolish. The generals had tolerated Hitler's rise because he promised to rearm Germany and restore its military greatness, but they were not prepared to see their institutions submerged into a rowdy paramilitary under a loud homosexual revolutionary. President Hindenburg, still alive but visibly declining in health, shared the military establishment's deep distaste for the SA and its excesses, and crucially, Hitler himself had begun to see Röhm's ambitions as a threat to his own position. If Röhm successfully merged the SA with the army and became the commander of Germany's combined military forces, where would that leave Hitler? A second power center, a rival base of institutional authority, was incompatible with the absolute power Hitler was building. But there were other voices pushing Hitler toward a more violent solution. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the SS intelligence service, had been carefully building a dossier on Röhm, collecting and in some cases fabricating evidence of plots and conspiracies. They presented Hitler with intelligence suggesting that Röhm was planning an armed coup against the government, the so-called Röhm Putsch. The evidence was questionable at best, fabricated at worst, but it served Himmler's purposes perfectly. If Hitler could be convinced that Röhm was planning treason, the SS would be authorized to act, and acting would mean destroying the SA as a rival to SS power, while simultaneously eliminating a potential rival to Hitler's own absolute authority. Göring had his own reasons to want Röhm gone. The SA's chaos interfered with his ambitions for the Prussian power base he was building. And from a different direction, conservative advisers around Hindenburg and Vice-Chancellor von Papen were warning that Röhm's calls for a second revolution were destabilizing Germany and risking military confrontation. In June 1934, von Papen gave a speech at Marburg University, written in large part by his aide Edgar Jung, that carefully but unmistakably criticized the regime's excesses, the suppression of debate, and the violence that was preventing Germany from normalizing. It was, in the context of 1934, an act of remarkable courage. Hitler was furious. Goebbels banned all press coverage of the speech. Edgar Jung was arrested and would be murdered within weeks. But the speech told Hitler something important. The conservative establishment around Hindenburg was running out of patience with the SA's disorder, and Hindenburg himself might be induced to use his presidential authority to impose martial law if the situation were not resolved. On the night of June 29th and into the early hours of June 30th, 1934, Hitler struck what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The Röhm-Putsch, as the Nazis officially termed it, was a coordinated massacre carried out by the SS and Gestapo across Germany. Hitler himself flew to Munich that morning, personally confronting Röhm and his entourage at the resort town of Bad Wiessee on the shores of Lake Tegernsee, where Röhm and senior SA officers had gathered for a conference. The men were arrested in their beds. Some resisted and were shot on the spot. Röhm himself was taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich. Initial reports suggested Hitler was reluctant to order Röhm's personal execution. These were men who had known each other for over a decade, who had shared the violent, formative years of the Nazi movement together. But within 48 hours, Hitler gave the order. On July 1st, 1934, 2 SS officers entered Röhm's cell, laid a pistol on the table and left. Röhm refused to use it. They returned and he was shot at point-blank range. His last reported words were, "If I am to be killed, let Adolf do it himself." It was not a request that would be honoured. The killings extended far beyond the SA leadership. The Night of the Long Knives was also used as an opportunity to settle old political scores and eliminate potential future rivals under cover of the emergency. General Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's immediate predecessor as Chancellor and a man who had many powerful contacts and considerable political cunning, was shot dead at his home in Neubabelsberg, along with his wife. There was no pretense of any connection to Röhm's alleged plot. Schleicher was simply a man whose intelligence and connections made him potentially dangerous, and the chaos of the purge provided the perfect moment to remove him permanently. Gregor Strasser, who had been one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi Party's organizational structure before breaking with Hitler in December 1932, was arrested and shot in his cell. Edgar Jung, von Papen's speechwriter, who had authored the Marburg speech, was murdered. Gustav von Kahr, the Bavarian state commissioner who had helped suppress Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923, an act of betrayal that Hitler had never forgiven, was dragged from his home, taken to the Dachau concentration camp and beaten to death with pickaxes. Old grievances, new threats, imagined conspiracies, all of them were settled in a single orgy of blood that lasted from the night of June 29th to approximately July 2nd, 1934. The official number of those killed was given as 77, but historians believe the actual total was somewhere between 100 and 200 people. The legal justification for this mass murder was provided, with jaw-dropping cynicism after the fact. On July 3, 1934, a cabinet resolution drafted by the Interior Minister and Justice Minister declared that the measures taken on June 30th and July 1st and 2nd had been legal acts of state self-defense in emergency situations. In other words, murder without trial, carried out by the SS on the personal order of the Chancellor, was retroactively declared to be self-defense and therefore legal. The law was signed by the entire cabinet, including those conservatives like Papen and the defense minister Werner von Blomberg, who had privately expressed horror at the violence. They signed it anyway. The constitutional theorist Carl Schmitt, who had provided intellectual respectability to the Nazi legal revolution with his concept of sovereign decision in the state of exception, rushed to publish an article arguing that Hitler's actions on the Night of the Long Knives were not the murder of citizens, but the highest form of law enforcement by the sovereign who stood above normal law. The Führer protects the law from the worst abuse when, in the moment of danger, he himself creates justice as the highest judge, Schmitt wrote. It was the legal profession's greatest capitulation, and it defined perfectly the moral abyss into which German jurisprudence had fallen. What did the Night of the Long Knives accomplish beyond the physical elimination of Röhm and his associates? In political terms, it accomplished several things simultaneously. It destroyed the SA as an independent power centre, relegating it to a ceremonial and social role. It elevated the SS to a position of supreme authority within the Nazi security state, with Himmler answerable directly to Hitler and the SS formally separated from the SA's chain of command. It eliminated the most credible internal challenges to Hitler's personal authority. And it sent an unmistakable message to every institution and every individual in Germany about the absolute nature of the power they were now dealing with. If the government could order the murder of its own senior officials, justify it legally after the fact, and face no meaningful challenge from courts, parliament, military, or public opinion, then the concept of legal protection for any individual was simply gone. The Night of the Long Knives was the moment when many Germans who had been telling themselves that the Nazi government was merely authoritarian, merely nationalist, merely conservative in a new form, could no longer avoid confronting what it actually was. The German army, however, drew a more self-interested lesson. The Wehrmacht's generals had watched the destruction of the SA with relief and satisfaction. Their institutional rival was gone. Hitler had demonstrated that he could and would protect the professional military from being submerged into a mass revolutionary movement, and the generals showed their gratitude in the most consequential way imaginable. When President Paul von Hindenburg died on August 2, 1934, of lung cancer at his estate at Neudeck in East Prussia, Hitler moved within hours. A law was promulgated combining the offices of President and Chancellor into a single position to be held by Adolf Hitler under the title of Führer and Reich Chancellor. This had actually been prepared in advance. The law was dated August 1st, the day before Hindenburg died, suggesting either remarkable preparation or a discreet understanding with those managing the dying president's final hours. The question of whether this merger was legal under the Weimar Constitution, which had specified that the presidency could not be combined with the chancellorship, was simply ignored. And then came the moment that, more than any other single event, made Hitler truly untouchable. On August 2, 1934, the same day that Hindenburg died, every officer and soldier of the German armed forces was required to swear a new oath of loyalty. Under the Weimar Republic, and even in the initial months of the Nazi government, the military oath had been sworn to the German constitution and to the German people. The new oath was fundamentally, shockingly different. It read, "I swear by God this sacred oath that I shall render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and that I shall at all times be ready, as a brave soldier, to give my life for this oath." Three things made this oath historically unprecedented and catastrophically consequential. First, it was sworn to a person, Adolf Hitler by name, not to an institution, not to a constitution, not to the abstract concept of Germany, but to one specific individual. Second, the obedience it demanded was explicitly described as unconditional, without qualification, without reservation, without the possibility of conscientious exception. Third, it bound the soldier to this obedience with a sacred oath invoking God, meaning that for men who took religious oaths seriously, and most German military officers did, breaking it was not merely a legal or political act, but a theological one, a sin. The psychological and institutional consequences of this oath would echo for the entire duration of the Third Reich. When officers later contemplated resistance or conspiracy against Hitler, they faced not just the practical dangers of discovery, but the profound conviction drilled into them from childhood that oath-breaking was dishonourable, that it was the act that had made the November criminals traitors. It would take years of war, millions of deaths, and the revelation of crimes on an almost incomprehensible scale before a sufficient number of officers could bring themselves to act against a man they had sworn, before God, to obey without condition. The oath was administered simultaneously to every member of the armed forces across Germany on August 2, 1934. Field marshals and generals, colonels and lieutenants, sergeants and privates, all of them raised their right hands and spoke the same words on the same afternoon. No one refused. No senior officer resigned in protest. No meaningful discussion was recorded of whether soldiers should or could decline. General Werner von Blomberg, the defense minister who had co-authored with Hitler the legal merger of the presidential and chancellorial powers, organized the oath administration and presented it to the officer corps as a natural and desirable expression of the military's support for the new order. The Wehrmacht had, in a single ceremony, bound itself irrevocably to the personal will of Adolf Hitler. The last institution in Germany that possessed the physical capacity to challenge or depose Hitler had surrendered that capacity voluntarily, through an oath sworn in good faith by men who told themselves they were serving their country. Was there genuine grief for Hindenburg among ordinary Germans? Undoubtedly some. The old Field Marshal had been a symbol of stability, the last surviving connection to Imperial Germany's military glory. A figure who represented something older and more traditionally conservative than the Nazi movement itself. His death removed the one individual who had possessed sufficient personal prestige and constitutional authority to impose real limits on Hitler, at least theoretically. Whether Hindenburg had ever been willing to exercise that authority in a meaningful way is deeply questionable. By 1934, his mental faculties were seriously impaired by age and illness, and he had allowed himself to be managed by the advisors around him. But his mere existence had been a constraint, a reminder that someone stood above Hitler in formal constitutional terms. With his death, even that reminder was gone. Hitler held a lavish state funeral for Hindenburg at the Tannenberg Memorial in East Prussia, the site of Hindenburg's greatest military victory in 1914. The spectacle was magnificent, and the propaganda value enormous. Hitler as the respectful successor to Germany's military tradition, the natural heir of its national glory. Within weeks, he had also consolidated legal control of Hindenburg's East Prussian estates, which passed to the German state, eliminating any potential focal point for conservative opposition around the Hindenburg family name. A plebiscite on August 19, 1934, asked the German people to approve the merger of the presidential and chancellorial offices. With all opposition suppressed, with media entirely under state control, with the memory of the Night of the Long Knives barely 6 weeks old, with the economic recovery providing genuine popular support for the regime, the result was nearly inevitable. Almost 88% of those who voted said yes. Roughly 5.5 million Germans, about 10% of the electorate, voted no or submitted invalid ballots, in what was simultaneously a remarkable act of individual courage and a heartbreaking demonstration of the limits of popular resistance when the mechanisms of free political expression have been destroyed. But the official result was presented to the world and to Germany as an overwhelming popular mandate, proof that the German people freely endorsed Hitler's absolute authority. The international press, uncertain how to interpret what was happening in Germany and generally disposed toward wishful thinking about the regime's moderation, reported the numbers and moved on. By August 19, 1934, just 19 months after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the transformation was complete. The man who had entered the Reich Chancellery as the leader of a minority coalition was now the sole political authority in Germany. He was, simultaneously, head of state, head of government, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and leader of the only legal political party. He controlled the press, the radio, the film industry, and the educational system. His secret police monitored every aspect of German life. The courts that should have protected citizens from arbitrary power had been purged and reconstituted as instruments of his will. The churches that might have provided a moral counterweight had been neutralized through a combination of concordats, co-optation, and intimidation. The trade unions that had given the working class organizational power had been destroyed. Big business had made its peace with him. The military had sworn a personal oath to him by name. No institution of German public life remained genuinely independent. No legal mechanism existed to remove him from office. No physical force was positioned to challenge him. In every meaningful sense, Adolf Hitler was untouchable. But how had this happened so fast? How had a country with a constitution, a professional civil service, an educated middle class, a free press and independent courts arrived at this destination in less than 2 years? The answer lies not just in the actions of the Nazi Party, but in the failures and choices of those who might have stopped them. And examining those failures is perhaps the most important lesson that the events of 1933 and 1934 have to offer. So let us look more carefully at the specific mechanisms, the specific individuals, and the specific moments of decision, and indecision that made Hitler untouchable, because understanding them in detail is the only way to understand why this story still matters. The speed of Germany's transformation from a functioning, if troubled, democracy into a totalitarian dictatorship is perhaps the most consistently underestimated aspect of the entire story. When we speak of 19 months, from January 30th, 1933 to August 19th, 1934, we are speaking of a period shorter than most university degrees, shorter than a single term in the United States Senate, barely longer than a pregnancy. In less than 2 years, an entire constitutional order was dismantled, an entire independent civil society was destroyed, and an entire nation was reoriented around the absolute will of a single individual. To understand how this was possible, we need to examine not just the instruments of Nazi power, but the structural vulnerabilities that made the Weimar Republic susceptible to exactly this kind of attack. Because without those vulnerabilities, Hitler's political genius, and it was a genuine form of genius, however catastrophically evil its application, would not have been sufficient. The Weimar Republic's constitution, drafted by the constitutional lawyer Hugo Preuss and adopted in August 1919, was in many respects one of the most progressive and thoughtfully designed constitutions of its era. It guaranteed extensive fundamental rights, established universal suffrage, including votes for women years before most democracies, created an independent judiciary, and attempted to balance federal and national authority in a reasonable way. But it contained several critical structural weaknesses that the Nazis would exploit with devastating precision. Article 48, the emergency decree provision that we have already encountered in the context of the Reichstag fire decree, was perhaps the most important. Intended as a safeguard allowing the president to govern by emergency decree during genuine crises, it had been invoked over 230 times during the Weimar period before Hitler even came to power, as governments used it to bypass an unworkable parliamentary arithmetic. By 1933, governing by emergency decree rather than through legislation had become almost normal. The constitutional barriers against its misuse, including the ability of the Reichstag to override emergency decrees and the expectation that they would be temporary, had been worn smooth through decades of overuse. Proportional representation, as already noted, produced a parliament so fragmented that stable majority government was essentially impossible. But the deeper problem was that proportional representation without a significant minimum threshold allowed extremist parties on both ends of the political spectrum to gain parliamentary representations and use it primarily as a platform for undermining Parliament itself. The Nazis were open about this tactic. They did not enter elections because they believed in electoral democracy. They entered elections because elections gave them an audience, a stage, a way of converting popular discontent into institutional presence. Once inside the Reichstag, they used every mechanism available to obstruct, disrupt, and delegitimize the very institution in which they sat. And when the institution responded, as it inevitably did with frustration and dysfunction, this was presented to the public as further evidence of democracy's failure rather than evidence of the extremists' bad faith. The polarization of German politics between 1930 and 1933 was also crucial, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, was a powerful force in its own right, winning between 10 and 17% of the vote in the elections of this period. The KPD was not a democratic party. It was openly committed to the violent overthrow of the bourgeois state and the establishment of a Soviet-style government. Its propaganda was explicitly revolutionary. Its paramilitary formations, the Red Front Fighters League, engaged in street violence and political intimidation that paralleled the SA's methods, if on a smaller scale. The KPD's existence and its aggressive revolutionary rhetoric served Hitler's purposes in two important ways. First, it genuinely frightened the German middle class, the business community, the churches, and the military into believing that the Nazi movement, however rough and unpleasant, was at least a defense against communist revolution. Second, the KPD's refusal to cooperate with the Social Democrats, because the Communist International's line was that Social Democrats were social fascists more dangerous than actual fascists, prevented the left from uniting against the Nazi threat. If the Social Democrats and the Communists had been able to set aside their ideological rivalry and cooperate, they could have outpolled the Nazis in every election of the early 1930s. They never did, And that failure of the German left to unite against fascism remains one of the most consequential political failures of the 20th century. The role of the conservative establishment in facilitating Hitler's rise is worth examining in considerable depth, because it is a story that illuminates not just Germany in 1933, but the perennial danger of those who believe they can use and control forces they do not understand. The conservative nationalists who arranged Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, men like Franz von Papen, the press baron Alfred Hugenberg, who led the German National People's Party, the former German Crown Prince Wilhelm, the industrialists, and the military advisors around Hindenburg, shared certain attitudes with Hitler on the fundamental questions of the day. They despised the Weimar Republic, or at least its democratic elements. They loathed the left, the trade unions, and the socialist movement. They wanted to see German military power restored and the humiliations of Versailles undone. They believed that Germany needed strong leadership rather than endless parliamentary squabbling. On all of these points, they and Hitler were in rough alignment. Where they differed was in their sense of what the new Germany should look like and who should run it. The conservatives imagined something like an authoritarian monarchy, a strong, traditional state with a powerful executive that would govern without the chaos of parliamentary democracy, but would remain within recognizable elite social and cultural parameters. They imagined that Hitler and his movement could serve as the popular engine for this transformation, providing the mass base and street muscle that the conservative establishment lacked, while the actual governing would be done by men of education, breeding, and experience, men like themselves. This vision was not only politically catastrophic but psychologically revealing. It reflected a profound failure to understand what the Nazi movement actually was, what it wanted, and what it was capable of doing. The conservatives saw in Hitler a useful instrument because they could not imagine taking seriously on any fundamental level a man of his social origins, his cultural roughness, his limited education, and his apparent fanaticism. They condescended to him even as they courted him, and that condescension blinded them to the nature of the force they were releasing. There is a telling anecdote from the summer of 1934, after the Night of the Long Knives, when Franz von Papen, who had narrowly escaped being murdered himself, his aides were killed while he was merely arrested and detained for several days, went to Hitler and protested the murders, particularly of Schleicher. Hitler's response was a masterclass in the psychology of intimidation. He was simultaneously threatening and friendly, implying that Papen had been spared as a personal favour and that his continued safety depended on his discretion and loyalty. Papen understood perfectly. He thanked Hitler, accepted the position of German ambassador to Austria, a demotion that was simultaneously an exile that saved his life by getting him out of Berlin, and said nothing more. The man who had assured everyone that Hitler would be squeezed into a corner within 2 months spent the next decade as one of the Nazi regime's most useful foreign policy instruments, serving as ambassador to Turkey after Austria, before ending up in the dock at Nuremberg in 1946. He was acquitted there, remarkably, but convicted by a German denazification court in 1947 and sentenced to 8 years of hard labour, serving 2 years before his release. He died in 1969 at the age of 89, having outlived his entire generation of conservative politicians and having written self-exculpatory memoirs that blamed everyone but himself for Germany's catastrophe. Papen's trajectory is instructive because it illustrates how difficult it was, once Hitler had genuinely consolidated power, for anyone who had been near the centre of events to tell the truth about what they had done. The alternative to self-serving historical revisionism was to acknowledge an act of staggering recklessness that had led directly to the worst catastrophe in modern history. That was a truth very few men of Papen's generation were capable of confronting honestly. And so, the myths multiplied. The myth that Hitler had been far cleverer than anyone could reasonably have anticipated, the myth that the circumstances had left no real alternative, the myth that the real catastrophe, meaning the Holocaust and the war, was something that could not have been foreseen from the events of 1933. All of these myths were convenient, and all of them were false. What about the international community? How did the world's democracies respond to what was happening in Germany? The answer, in brief, is with inadequate alarm and excessive hope. Britain and France, the two great European democracies, were exhausted by the First World War, committed to avoiding another one, and deeply uncertain about how to interpret the Nazi revolution. British newspapers initially took a cautiously optimistic view, noting that Germany had elected its government democratically and that the new chancellor was committed to ending communist disruption. The Times of London ran editorials suggesting that Hitler's nationalist ardour would moderate once he had the responsibilities of office, an argument that proved precisely as wrong as the identical arguments being made by German conservatives. Some British politicians and diplomats visiting Germany in 1933 returned with impressions of order, energy, and economic recovery that compared favourably, in their view, with the disorder and economic stagnation of Weimar. France was more alarmed, more acutely aware of historical precedent, and more directly threatened by German rearmament, which the Nazis were pursuing openly from early 1933 in clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. But France's political system in the 1930s was itself deeply dysfunctional, cycling through governments almost as rapidly as Weimar Germany had, divided between its own left and right factions, and unable to formulate a consistent foreign policy toward the new Germany. The Soviet Union, ironically, was the first state to grasp the true nature of the Nazi regime, but the Soviets' geopolitical calculation was initially to try to maintain normal state relations with Germany while building a security structure against it, a fundamentally contradictory policy. The United States, 3,000 miles away and consumed by its own depression, watched events in Germany with a mixture of concern and detachment. President Franklin Roosevelt had taken office in March 1933, the same month as the Enabling Act, and had his hands full with the New Deal and domestic economic recovery. America's diplomatic response to Nazi Germany in 1933 and 1934 was cautious accommodation rather than principled opposition. The League of Nations, the international body established after the First World War to maintain collective security and resolve disputes peacefully, proved completely ineffective against the Nazi challenge. Germany left the League in October 1933, and the League's response was to note its regret. When Germany announced open rearmament in March 1935, the League's formal protest was equally toothless. The international community's failure to mount any meaningful resistance to Hitler in 1933 and 1934 removed a potential external check on his behaviour and almost certainly reinforced his conviction that the democracies were too weak and too timid to challenge German power as it rebuilt. The role of ideology in Hitler's consolidation of power is perhaps the deepest and most troubling element of the entire story, because it was ideology that converted an ordinary political seizure of power into something qualitatively different. The Nazis were not just authoritarians seeking power for its own sake, though the power was certainly what Hitler craved. They were true believers in a racial ideology of extraordinary darkness, and from the very first days of their government, that ideology was being translated into policy. The April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses, organised by the SA and the party as a nationwide action on April 1st, a day Hitler chose with characteristic theatrical instinct as a warning, was the first formal act of state-sponsored anti-Semitic discrimination. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed on April 7, 1933, expelled Jews and political opponents from government positions. The law against overcrowding of German schools and universities, passed in the same month, set quotas limiting Jewish enrollment. Professional organizations for lawyers, doctors, dentists, and pharmacists began excluding Jewish members. All of this happened within the first 100 days, and it laid the legal and institutional groundwork for the increasingly radical persecution that would follow throughout the 1930s and culminate in genocide. The early anti-Semitic measures of 1933 created a profound test for German society, and German society, by and large, failed that test. Some individual Germans protested quietly. Some refused to participate in the boycotts. Some maintained personal friendships with Jewish colleagues and neighbours for longer than others. But the organised institutions of German civil society, the churches, the professional associations, the business community, the academic community, offered no meaningful collective resistance to the exclusion of Jewish Germans from public life. The silence of the churches is particularly striking. Neither the Catholic hierarchy nor the mainstream Protestant churches issued formal protests against the anti-Semitic laws of 1933. Individual clergy spoke out, but they did so as individuals, not as representatives of institutions willing to stake their authority on a principled defense of their Jewish fellow citizens. The churches were, in their own way, making the same calculation as the conservative politicians. They would protect their own institutional interests and hope that accommodation would preserve their ability to practice their faith and maintain their social role. It was a comprehensible calculation and a disastrous one. The German academic community's response was similarly dismal. German universities had been among the finest in the world, centres of scientific and humanistic achievement that had produced a disproportionate share of the world's Nobel laureates. The faculty of those universities watched as their Jewish colleagues were expelled, as student unions carried out the book burnings, as ideological conformity was imposed through new hiring criteria and required courses on racial science. A minority protested and was punished for it. A larger minority emigrated, taking with them a brain drain of extraordinary proportions. Einstein, Freud, Erwin Schrödinger, Otto Stern, Max Born, and dozens of other scientists of the first rank who enriched their adopted countries while impoverishing German science. The majority stayed and adapted, finding ways to continue their work within the constraints of the new system, telling themselves that scholarship could maintain its integrity. Within the political framework, telling themselves lies that were convenient and comfortable and, in many cases, professionally necessary. By 1935, every German university had been brought into ideological conformity through a combination of expulsions, voluntary retirements, and the pressure of faculty members who were genuine Nazis or genuine opportunists. What was happening to ordinary children in Germany during this period? The youth of 1933 and 1934 were the people who would be teenagers when the war began in 1939, and soldiers when it reached its bloodiest moments in the mid-1940s. The Nazi regime understood from the very beginning that the generation it needed most was not the adults who had grown up with different values and different loyalties, but the children who could be formed entirely within the framework of National Socialist ideology. Adolf Hitler had said it explicitly in Mein Kampf: whoever had the youth had the future. The implementation of that principle began in 1933 with dramatic speed and thoroughness. The Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend, had existed since 1926 but grew explosively after 1933. By the end of 1933, membership had jumped from roughly 100,000 to over 2 million. The law on the Hitler Youth, passed in December 1936, would eventually make membership compulsory for all German boys aged 10 to 18 and all German girls aged 10 to 21 in the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel. But even before formal compulsion was introduced, social pressure was so intense that non-participation became practically impossible. Boys who were not in the Hitler Youth were excluded from sports clubs and youth activities, ostracized by peers and potentially marked as politically suspect, a status whose consequences for their families could be serious. The Hitler Youth provided boys with adventure, comradeship, physical activity, and a sense of belonging to something large and important. It was, from a certain psychological perspective, genuinely appealing, and many young Germans joined enthusiastically, rather than merely under compulsion. The ideological content was insidious precisely because it was embedded within activities that boys naturally enjoyed: camping, hiking, sports, marching, games of strategy and tactics, the racism, the militarism, the absolute obedience to authority. All of this was woven seamlessly into activities that would have been pleasant in any other context. Schools were equally transformed. In April 1933, Bernhard Rust was appointed Reich Minister of Science, Education and Popular Culture. Rust, a former schoolteacher who had been dismissed from his position before joining the Nazi Party on grounds of mental instability, was an unlikely educational reformer, but his instructions were clear. German education at every level was to be remade to serve National Socialist ideology. Textbooks were rewritten. New required subjects included racial biology and German prehistory, both taught from a Nazi ideological perspective. Physical education received dramatically increased emphasis, reflecting the regime's valorization of the healthy, martial body over intellectual achievement. Jewish teachers were removed from classrooms. Teachers who could not demonstrate ideological reliability were pressured, retrained, or dismissed. By 1935, the National Socialist Teachers League claimed membership of over 300,000 teachers, representing the vast majority of Germany's teaching force. Whether they joined out of conviction, opportunism, or fear of the consequences of non-membership varied enormously by individual, but the organizational fact was the same. The people responsible for forming young German minds were formally enrolled in a Nazi organization and subject to its ideological expectations. The transformation of German art and culture during 1933 and 1934 tells us something important about the comprehensive nature of the Nazi project. The Nazis did not merely want to control German politics and economics, they wanted to control German identity, German aesthetics, German memory, German imagination. The Reich Chamber of Culture, under Goebbels' overall direction, divided the entire cultural sphere into separate chambers for music, theatre, film, literature, fine arts, press and radio, each with mandatory membership requirements and the power to exclude Jews and political opponents. This was not censorship in the traditional sense, the banning of specific works. It was something more thoroughgoing, the elimination from German cultural life of entire categories of people who created work that failed to fit the Nazi racial and ideological model. What replaced them? Officially approved art that celebrated Germanic heroism, Nordic physical beauty, rural German life, military valor, and the racial community. The works of artists like Paul Ludwig Trost, whom Hitler regarded as the great architectural voice of the new Germany, and sculptors like Arno Brieker, whose massively muscled, idealized heroic figures lined Nazi public spaces, defined the official aesthetic. It was grand, it was declamatory, and it was in the service of power rather than truth. The 1937 Degenerate Art exhibition, which came a few years after the period we are examining, would display confiscated works of modernism, Expressionism, Dadaism, New Objectivity, alongside mocking labels describing them as products of Jewish Bolshevism and mental illness. But the Cultural Revolution began in 1933. By the end of that year, every major cultural institution in Germany was under Nazi control or influence. Opera houses, symphony orchestras, theatres, film studios, art galleries, all of them had been purged of Jewish artists and politically unreliable personnel and placed under the supervision of ideologically reliable directors answerable to Goebbels' ministry. The German cultural scene, which had been one of the most vibrant and innovative in the world during the Weimar years. Think of Brecht, of Weil, of the Bauhaus, of the Expressionist painters, of the great German cinema from Nosferatu to the Blue Angel, was transformed into a desert of approved mediocrity in the name of racial and national authenticity. One of the most revealing windows into how ordinary Germans experienced this transformation comes from the diaries and letters of private individuals, many of which survived the war and have been studied by historians seeking to understand what the Nazis called the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community from the inside. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish professor of Romance languages at the Technical University of Dresden, who kept an extraordinarily detailed diary throughout the Nazi years, provides one of the most intimate and devastating accounts of what it felt like to watch one's world being dismantled piece by piece. By 1933, he had already been dismissed from his academic post under the April Civil Service Law. By 1934, he was barred from using public libraries. The cumulative effect of hundreds of small humiliations and legal restrictions, each seemingly manageable on its own, each incrementally narrowing the space within which Jewish Germans could live and work and be, is documented in Klemperer's diaries with a precision that is both historically invaluable and almost unbearable to read. He noted, with the philologist's eye for language, how the Nazis were creating what he called the LTI, the Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich, a new vocabulary designed to alter the way Germans thought about their world. Words like fanatical were rehabilitated from pejorative to laudatory. Propaganda ceased to carry negative connotations. Abstract nouns like will and blood and soil acquired quasi-mystical resonances. The manipulation of language was itself a form of power, shaping not just what people said, but what they were able to think. What specific mechanisms allowed Hitler to move so fast and encounter so little organized resistance? The speed is truly staggering when you look at it in sequence. The Reichstag fire decree came on February 28th, 1 month after taking power. The Enabling Act on March 23rd. The trade unions destroyed on May 2nd. The parties dissolved by July 14th, the night of the Long Knives on June 30th, 1934. Hindenburg dead on August 2nd. The oath sworn the same day. The plebiscite on August 19th. 19 months from first day in office to complete, total, unchallenged power. Part of the answer lies in what German political scientists have called the coordination dilemma, the problem that faces any group seeking to organize resistance to a rapidly moving authoritarian takeover. For individuals and institutions to resist effectively, they need to be able to trust each other, communicate, coordinate their actions, and be reasonably confident that their resistance will be joined by enough others to make it effective rather than merely suicidal. The Nazis' strategy was to act fast enough and to deploy enough uncertainty and fear to prevent those conditions for effective coordination from ever crystallizing. By the time any given institution had decided that the situation was serious enough to warrant resistance, its potential allies had already been neutralized, intimidated, or corrupted. Each institution faced the choice between accommodation and isolated, unsupported resistance. And accommodation was the rational choice for any individual actor, even when resistance would have been the collectively rational choice for all actors together. This dynamic, in which individually rational choices produce collectively catastrophic outcomes, is one of the reasons why democratic institutions, once they begin to erode, can collapse with terrifying speed. There is another element that is often underappreciated in accounts of Hitler's consolidation of power, and that is the role of charisma and genuine belief. It would be comforting to think that only those who were forced, intimidated, or calculating in their own material interest supported the Nazi regime. The reality is more uncomfortable. Millions of Germans believed in Adolf Hitler with a sincerity and intensity that seems, from a later historical vantage point, almost incomprehensible. They believed because they wanted to believe. They believed because the Depression had destroyed their material security and Hitler was offering recovery. They believed because German national humiliation had wounded their collective pride and Hitler was offering restored greatness. They believed because the Weimar Republic's dysfunction had made them desperate for decisive leadership, and Hitler was offering certainty. And they believed because the regime's propaganda was extraordinarily effective, addressing emotional rather than rational needs with a sophistication that the Democratic parties simply could not match. A social democratic campaign poster featuring facts and figures about unemployment statistics could not compete on an emotional level with a torchlit Nuremberg rally at which 100,000 people collectively experienced the intoxicating sensation of belonging to something larger than themselves, something destined for greatness, something led by a man who seemed to embody the national will. Historians have debated extensively the question of how much Germans knew about the violence being done in their name during the early years of the regime. The concentration camps were reported in the German press, albeit in sanitized euphemistic terms. The April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses was a public event, visible in every German town. The book burnings were organized public spectacles. The violence of the SA against political opponents was conducted in the open, on the streets. So the answer to what did they know is quite a lot if they chose to look. The more important question is what they chose to do with that knowledge, and the answer for the majority was nothing or very little. Not necessarily because they approved of every act of violence. Many were uncomfortable with the roughness of Nazi methods even while supporting Nazi goals, but because the events being reported were being framed in ways that allowed them to seem either justified or exaggerated, and because the psychological and social cost of confronting the truth was high, while the immediate personal cost of not confronting it was low. This moral sequencing, in which the choice not to see seemed individually reasonable while collectively it enabled catastrophe, is one of the defining features of how the Nazi regime maintained itself in its early years. The men who resisted deserve their own careful attention, both because their stories are genuinely extraordinary and because understanding why resistance was possible for some but not others illuminates the broader dynamics of the Nazi consolidation. We have already mentioned Otto Wels, who gave that remarkable speech in the Kroll Opera House on March 23, 1933, and Martin Niemöller of the Confessing Church. But there were others, less famous, who chose refusal at tremendous personal cost. Hans Litten was a young Jewish lawyer who had made his name defending communist workers in political trials during the Weimar years, and who had once forced Adolf Hitler himself to testify in court in a civil case in 1931, subjecting the future dictator to a humiliating cross-examination. For this, Litten paid a price beyond imagining. He was arrested on the night of the Reichstag fire, February 28, 1933, and would spend the following 5 years being moved between concentration camps Sonnenberg, Lichtenberg, Dachau, Mauthausen, where he was subjected to systematic torture. On February 5, 1938, he was found dead in his cell at Dachau. He was 34 years old. His story is not widely known outside Germany, but it represents something important: the regime's particular vindictiveness toward those who had dared to challenge it directly, who had used the tools of the law to expose and embarrass it, and who represented the principle that no person, not even the future Führer, was above legal accountability. The economic dimension of Hitler's consolidation of power is one that tends to be overshadowed in historical accounts by the political and ideological drama, but it was in many ways the most important factor in building the broad popular support that made the regime's stability possible. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany had approximately 6 million unemployed workers, an unemployment rate of roughly 30%. By 1936, that number had fallen to about 1 million. By 1938, Germany had effectively reached full employment. This dramatic economic recovery was not an accident, and it was not solely the result of Nazi policies, but it happened on the Nazis' watch, and they received the credit for it. Understanding what actually drove the recovery and who paid for it is essential to understanding the regime's political durability. The economic recovery was driven primarily by 2 engines. The first was massive public investment in infrastructure. Most famously, the Autobahn highway network, but also housing, public buildings, and the entire built environment of the new Germany. These projects absorbed hundreds of thousands of unemployed workers and had the additional propaganda value of being visible, impressive, and directly attributable to Hitler's government. The second and far more important engine was rearmament. From 1933 onward, Germany began rebuilding its military in systematic violation of the Treaty of Versailles, at first secretly, and then, from 1935, openly. Defense spending rose from about 1 billion Reichsmarks in 1933 to over 10 billion Reichsmarks in 1936. This massive military expenditure created jobs in the steel industry, the chemical industry, the armaments factories, the construction sector, and dozens of related fields. The men who built tanks and aircraft and warships were no longer unemployed. They were productive members of the new Germany, and many of them were genuinely grateful. But rearmament was ruinously expensive, and the Nazis had no conventional means of financing it. The solution was devised primarily by Hjalmar Schacht, the brilliant and amoral economist who served as president of the Reichsbank and then as economics minister during the early Nazi years. Schacht invented a complex financial mechanism using the MIFO bills, short for Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, a dummy corporation created specifically for this purpose, to secretly finance rearmament by issuing government-backed bills of exchange that didn't appear on official government accounts. MEFO bills allowed Germany to rearm at a pace that exceeded what conventional budgetary financing could have supported, while concealing the full scale of defense spending from foreign observers who might have objected. By 1938, 4 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO bills were outstanding, representing a massive hidden government debt that Schacht himself worried would eventually trigger inflation or financial crisis. He was pushed out of the economics ministry in 1937 and resigned from the Reichsbank presidency in 1939, in part because of his increasingly desperate warnings about the unsustainability of Germany's economic trajectory. Hitler's response was to replace Schacht with more compliant officials and press on. The economic problems would be solved by conquest, by seizing the resources of other countries. It was a strategy that required war, and Hitler was planning war from the beginning. The labour market transformation that underpinned the economic recovery also had a social dimension that reinforced political support for the regime. The destruction of the trade unions in May 1933 and their replacement by the German Labour Front, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront or DAF, had eliminated workers' ability to bargain collectively for wages or conditions. In theory, this should have been deeply unpopular with the working class, which had been one of the Social Democratic Party's strongest bases. In practice, the decline in wages that union destruction might have been expected to produce was offset by the massive expansion of employment. A lower wage in a factory was infinitely better than no wage in a breadline. And the DAF offered workers something the old trade unions had not, a program called Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, that provided subsidized leisure activities, sports facilities, theatrical performances, and, most famously, affordable vacation travel and cruises to working-class Germans who had never previously been able to afford such things. The cruise ships of the Strength Through Joy program, sailing to Norway or Madeira with their cargoes of German factory workers experiencing their first foreign travel, were simultaneously genuine improvements in workers' material lives and masterpieces of regime propaganda. They said, wordlessly but eloquently, that the Nazi government delivered results for ordinary Germans in ways that the Weimar Republic and the trade union movement never had. Women's role in the new Germany was carefully defined by Nazi ideology and had significant implications for how the consolidation of power was experienced by half the population. The Nazi model of womanhood was explicitly focused on motherhood and the domestic sphere. Women were to be the mothers of the future Germanic race, raising children to serve the national community. Professional careers for women were officially discouraged. Women in the civil service were systematically dismissed in 1933. The League of German Girls trained young women for domesticity, health, and the physical fitness required for bearing healthy children. The Mother's Cross, introduced in 1939 but prepared by the ideological groundwork of 1933 and 1934, awarded medals to women for bearing 4, 6, or 8 children, treating biological reproduction as a service to the state. And yet, the reality of women's lives under the early Nazi regime was more complex than the official ideology suggested. Women's labor force participation, far from declining as ideology demanded, actually increased as rearmament and public works created labor shortages. The regime needed women's labor even as it preached women's domesticity, and it managed this contradiction with the same flexibility that characterized its approach to many practical problems. The ideology served for propaganda purposes while practice bent to economic necessity. The physical landscape of Germany changed dramatically in 1933 and 1934 in ways that made the power shift visible and inescapable in everyday life. The Nazi flags, the swastika on its red and white field, appeared everywhere, on government buildings, on private businesses eager to display loyalty, on the streets during the endless parade of rallies and commemorations that the regime used to maintain a constant atmosphere of national celebration. The Hitler salute, the right arm extended, accompanied by the words "Heil Hitler," became the mandatory greeting for civil servants and was socially enforced throughout public life. Not giving the salute in an appropriate context could invite hostile attention. Giving it with insufficient enthusiasm might also be noticed. The physical performance of loyalty was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that were at once trivial and deeply significant, because each performance, each raised arm, each Heil Hitler muttered to a shopkeeper or a colleague, was simultaneously an act of conformity and a small surrender of the self. Hannah Arendt, writing about totalitarianism after the war, identified this mechanism as one of the most insidious features of Nazi rule. The way in which the regime made ordinary people into active, if minor, participants in its own performance, complicit through 1,000 tiny acts of compliance that each seemed too small to refuse, and yet together constituted the daily texture of a totalitarian society. The architecture of the Third Reich was another form of power made physical. Albert Speer, the young architect who became Hitler's favourite and would eventually serve as armaments minister, designed the Great Stage, settings of the Nuremberg rallies, the Cathedral of Light, in which 150 searchlights created vertical beams visible from miles away, turning an outdoor nighttime rally into an almost supernatural spectacle of light and darkness. He also worked on Hitler's grandiose plans for the redesign of Berlin into a world capital to be called Germania, with a boulevard wider than the Champs-Élysées and a domed Great Hall that would have been the largest enclosed space in the world. These plans were never fully realized, but their very ambition conveyed something important about how Hitler understood the relationship between physical space and political power. Architecture was not merely construction, it was a statement of permanence, of historical destiny, of a power so certain of itself that it could plan in centuries rather than years. How did the Jewish community of Germany experience and respond to the events of 1933 and 1934? The Jewish population of Germany in 1933 numbered approximately 525,000 people, representing just under 1% of the total German population. They were overwhelmingly assimilated into German society, many of them deeply patriotic, many of them veterans of the First World War, many of them leading contributors to German professional, intellectual, and cultural life. The anti-Semitism that they had faced during the Weimar years had been real, but had not been qualitatively different from the discrimination that Jewish communities faced in many European societies. Nothing in their experience, nothing in European experience, had prepared them for what was now happening. The response of the German Jewish community in 1933 was in many ways the response of people trying to process the impossible, a mixture of disbelief, hope that the worst would pass, practical adaptation to the new restrictions, and, for a significant minority, the agonizing decision to emigrate. The Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith, the largest Jewish communal organization in Germany, initially responded to Hitler's appointment with cautious watchfulness rather than panic, urging calm and hoping that the rule of law would be maintained. Within weeks, as the boycott of April 1st and the civil service laws of April 7th demonstrated the regime's intentions unmistakably, organizations like the Zionist Federation of Germany urged emigration, particularly to Palestine. But emigration was easier said than done. It meant leaving behind not just possessions and careers, but the entire web of relationships, memories, and social belonging that constituted a life. It meant navigating hostile bureaucracies in potential receiving countries that were often reluctant to admit Jewish refugees. It meant starting over from nothing in a foreign country, often in middle age. Between 1933 and 1939, approximately half of German Jews did emigrate, a remarkable proportion representing an enormous collective act of self-preservation. The other half stayed, for a variety of reasons: family ties, economic constraints, disbelief, hope, the simple human tendency to adapt to deteriorating conditions, one incremental step at a time rather than confronting the full trajectory. Those who stayed would, for the most part, face ultimate catastrophe in the years that followed. The story of Victor Klemperer, the Dresden professor we encountered earlier, illustrates perfectly the impossible choices facing Jewish Germans in 1933 and 1934. Klemperer was married to a Protestant woman and was himself a convert to Protestantism, which he hoped might offer some protection under the new regime's racial laws. He was a decorated veteran of the First World War. He had devoted his career to German language and culture. He loved Germany, deeply and sincerely. He could not bring himself to believe that a country that had produced Goethe and Schiller, that had given the world Bach and Beethoven, that had been his intellectual home for an entire lifetime, could truly intend to destroy him. He stayed. His Protestant wife Eva stayed with him, in a marriage that was genuinely heroic on her part. As Mischlinger, mixed marriages, faced increasing persecution, and she faced social ostracism and professional consequences for refusing to divorce him. They survived the war through a combination of luck: Eva's courage, the slight protection offered by their mixed marriage, and the chaos of Dresden's destruction in February 1945. Klemperer's diaries, published after the war as I Will Bear Witness, are one of the most important primary documents of the Nazi period, a testament to the power of observation and the importance of bearing witness even when, perhaps especially when, the world seems determined to make bearing witness impossible. By the autumn of 1934, the physical infrastructure of totalitarian control was essentially complete. The Gestapo, under Heinrich Himmler's overall direction following his gradual absorption of all German police functions into a centralized SS police apparatus, had established itself as the arbiter of life and death for any German deemed politically, racially, or ideologically unacceptable. The concentration camp system, beginning with Dachau, opened in March 1933, had expanded to include facilities at Oranienburg, Lichtenberg, Sachsenburg, and Esterwegen. These early camps were primarily instruments of political repression rather than of racial extermination. That horror was still years in the future, but they established the principle and practice of extrajudicial mass imprisonment and created the institutional template for what would follow. The inmates of 1933 and 1934 were mostly political prisoners: communists, socialists, trade union leaders, journalists, and clergymen. The scale was relatively small by the standards of what was to come, perhaps 27,000 people imprisoned at the peak in 1933, declining somewhat in 1934 as some were released after signing declarations of political abstinence. But the psychological impact was enormous, because word of the camp's existence, and some account of their conditions, circulated through German society, through whisper networks and rumour, even as the press maintained official silence. What did it feel like to live in Germany in the summer of 1934, after the Night of the Long Knives and before the formal proclamation of Hitler as Führer and Reich Chancellor? William Shirer, the American journalist who would later write The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, was in Germany throughout this period, keeping a diary that provides invaluable contemporary testimony. He noted the strange normalcy of surface life: the cafes open, the theatres running, the shops full, the streets clean, people going about their daily business, alongside the atmosphere of suppressed dread that underlay everything. Conversations at dinner tables or in professional settings had acquired a new quality: careful, circumspect, sensitive to who was listening, avoiding certain topics as a matter of instinctive self-preservation. The famous German directness, the willingness to argue and debate that had characterized the Weimar cafe culture, had been replaced by a kind of pervasive social caution. You never quite knew who might report a carelessly expressed opinion. You never quite knew whether the colleague who had seemed to share your reservations about the regime was actually a party informant. The atmosphere of surveillance, much of it imaginary since the Gestapo was not actually omnipresent, but the uncertainty was enough, produced a social conformity that was more effective than any actual secret police force could have achieved by itself. The summer of 1934 also saw the formal completion of the Nazi legal revolution, the transformation not just of who held power, but of the theoretical basis on which power was understood to rest. Carl Schmitt, the brilliant and sinister legal theorist who provided the intellectual architecture for this transformation, published in 1934 his essay The Führer Protects the Law, explicitly arguing that the Night of the Long Knives had been a legitimate exercise of sovereign authority. Schmitt's theoretical contribution was to articulate a doctrine of the state of exception in which the sovereign, meaning Hitler, was defined as the one who decided when normal law was suspended and emergency action required. In Schmitt's framework, Hitler was not above the law because the law had been broken. Hitler was the source of the law, and what he willed was by definition legal. This was not merely abstract philosophy, it was the operating doctrine of the Nazi state, the theoretical justification that allowed judges, lawyers, civil servants, and military officers to participate in the regime's actions without formally acknowledging that they were participating in illegality. The genius and the horror of it was that it required its participants to believe, or at least pretend to believe, that what they were doing was lawful, when in fact they were demolishing the very concept of law that gave their professional identities meaning. The international press responded to the Night of the Long Knives and Hindenburg's death with a mixture of horror and grudging respect that says much about the confusion of observers who could not quite bring themselves to accept what they were seeing. The British press noted that Hitler had acted decisively against the radical elements of his own movement, the SA's excesses, which some interpreted as evidence of moderation rather than of unrestricted violence. The murders of Schleicher and Strasser were reported, but they were sometimes contextualized as the inevitable violence of revolutionary politics, rather than as evidence of a government that murdered its citizens at will. This interpretive charity, this systematic preference for the most reassuring possible reading of German events, would characterize much of the international press's coverage of Nazi Germany throughout the 1930s, and would prove catastrophically wrong. There is one final figure worth examining in detail, because his story encapsulates so perfectly the moral and political catastrophe of 1933 and 1934. Hermann Göring, the World War I fighter ace, pour le mérite recipient, and one of Hitler's closest collaborators, embodied the corrupting intersection of personal ambition and political violence that characterized the Nazi seizure of power. Göring had joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and been wounded during the Beer Hall Putsch. He had served in the Reichstag, using parliamentary immunity to help organize the Nazi political machine. When Hitler became Chancellor, Göring was rewarded with a series of powerful positions: Reich Minister without portfolio, Prussian Minister of the Interior, and eventually Prussian Minister-President. These positions gave him control of the largest police force in Germany, which he immediately bent to Nazi purposes. It was Göring who organized the SA auxiliary police, Göring who created the Gestapo, Göring who established the first concentration camps in Prussia. He did all of this with energy, enthusiasm, and a complete absence of legal scruple. He was also personally corrupt on a spectacular scale, accumulating wealth, properties, and art collections in a manner that would eventually become something of a grotesque joke, even within the regime itself. But in 1933 and 1934, Göring was essential to the mechanics of Hitler's seizure of power. He provided the organizational muscle in Prussia that made the political revolution a physical reality, transforming Hitler's verbal orders into arrests, beatings, and killings. After the war, he would be tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. He cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946, at the age of 53. Even in death, he managed to outwit his captors, which he might have regarded in his peculiarly twisted value system as one final victory. And what of Reinhard Heydrich, the man who more than any other turned the SS and the Gestapo into instruments of absolute terror? Heydrich was born in 1904 in Halle an der Saale, the son of a musician. He was tall, blonde, athletically gifted, intellectually formidable, and utterly ruthless, a combination that Himmler found irresistible when Heydrich applied to join the SS in 1931, after being dismissed from the German Navy for conduct unbecoming an officer following a broken engagement. Himmler made Heydrich head of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, and gave him the task of building a surveillance and information apparatus that would give the SS dominance over all other intelligence and security organizations in Germany. Heydrich proved equal to this task with terrifying efficiency. By 1934, the SD had files on hundreds of thousands of Germans and was well on its way to the central position in the Nazi security apparatus that Heydrich would consolidate through the late 1930s. He was, in Hannah Arendt's phrase, one of the most intellectually able men in the senior Nazi leadership, a distinction that made him more, not less, dangerous. His path would lead to Prague, where in 1941 he served as Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, earning the nickname the Year, Hangman of Prague, for the ferocity of his rule, before being fatally wounded in a British-supported assassination attempt by Czech and Slovak paratroopers on May 27, 1942. He died on June 4, 1942, at the age of 38. In reprisal for his assassination, the Nazis destroyed the village of Lidis, killing all its men and older boys, sending its women to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and gassing most of its children. Even in death, Heydrich's shadow produced catastrophe. Heinrich Himmler himself, the quiet, bespectacled former chicken farmer who built the SS into the central instrument of Nazi terror, survived the war and attempted escape under an assumed identity. He was captured by British forces on May 21, 1945, near Bremerwörde in Lower Saxony. During a medical examination, he bit down on a concealed cyanide capsule and died within minutes. He was 44 years old, the man who had organized the Holocaust, who had built the concentration camp system, who had run the Einsatzgruppen death squads and the gas chambers of the extermination camps, died without trial, without accountability, leaving behind no testament, no explanation, no final confrontation with the enormity of what he had done. It was a fittingly ignoble end for a man whose entire career had been built on evasion of direct personal responsibility while organizing mass death at industrial scale. What legacy did the events of 1933 and 1934 leave for the future? The answer is written in the subsequent history of the 20th century with a clarity that needs no interpretation. The 19 months between Hitler's appointment and the consolidation of absolute power produced the political conditions for the Holocaust, for the Second World War, for the deaths of between 70 and 85 million people, for the physical destruction of most of European Jewry, for the devastation of a continent, and for a trauma that European civilization has never fully processed and never will. Every specific atrocity that followed, every concentration camp, Every Einsatzgruppen massacre, every ghetto liquidation, every death march was made possible by the destruction of the legal, institutional, and moral structures that might have checked or prevented it. The men and institutions that failed to provide those checks in 1933 and 1934, the conservatives who thought they could use Hitler, the churches that chose accommodation over prophecy, the judges who subordinated law to ideology, the generals who swore an unconditional personal oath, the businesses that funded the movement, the international community that hoped moderation would prevail, all of them bore responsibility for what followed. The distribution of that responsibility varies enormously, from the major perpetrators who designed and implemented mass murder to the bystanders who simply averted their gaze. But the moral thread connecting January 30th, 1933 to the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945 is continuous and unbroken. The lessons that historians and political scientists have drawn from this period are numerous, and they are genuinely applicable to the broader questions of democratic resilience and authoritarian temptation that the 21st century continues to face. Democratic institutions are not self-maintaining. They require active citizens, independent courts, a free press, and political leaders who respect constitutional constraints, not because they are legally compelled to do so, but because they genuinely believe in the system's legitimacy. Emergency powers designed to protect democracies can be turned against them if the checks on those powers are inadequate or worn down through overuse. Economic despair creates fertile ground for authoritarian movements that offer simple answers to complex problems. The demonization of minority groups, presenting them as existential threats to the national community, is a reliable precursor to violence and discrimination. And the fatal miscalculation of those who believe they can ally with extremists for tactical advantage and then contain them is a pattern that recurs with horrifying regularity in political history. There is one more thing worth saying about the men and women who did resist, because their stories, though they often ended in tragedy, matter enormously. Sophie Scholl, the Munich University student who with her brother Hans and other members of the White Rose Resistance Group distributed anti-Nazi leaflets in 1942 and 1943, was 21 years old when she was arrested, tried before the People's Court under the terrifying Roland Freisler, and guillotined within 4 days of her arrest. She had been born in 1921, meaning she was 12 years old in 1933. A child when the Nazi Revolution happened, someone who grew up entirely within the system and yet managed to find within herself the moral clarity and the courage to say no. Her example, and the examples of the thousands of others who risked and often lost their lives in resistance to the regime, tells us something important: that the human capacity for moral clarity and courage does not disappear under totalitarianism, even if it becomes much rarer and much more costly to exercise. The resistors were exceptions, but they were not impossibilities, and their existence refutes the consoling myth that there was simply nothing to be done. The question that all of this raises, the question that the events of 1933 and 1934 pose to us across the nearly century that separates their occurrence from our contemplation of them, is not merely historical. It is not a question about what Germans in the 1930s should have done differently, though that is certainly worth thinking about. It is a question about the conditions that allow democracy to survive, and about our own obligations as citizens of democratic societies to tend and defend the institutions and norms that protect us from the kind of catastrophe that Germany experienced. The Weimar Republic was not a failed or inferior democracy. It was a democracy that failed under specific historical pressures and because of specific institutional weaknesses and specific political choices. Those pressures, those weaknesses, and those choices are not unique to Germany in 1933. They are features of democratic politics more broadly, and understanding them in their most extreme historical manifestation is essential preparation for recognizing and resisting their appearance in less extreme forms. By August 19, 1934, Adolf Hitler had made himself untouchable through a combination of legal manipulation, political violence, institutional co-optation, propaganda mastery, economic performance, and the systematic destruction of every independent source of authority in German life. He had done it with breathtaking speed, using the tools of democracy to dismantle democracy, exploiting the legitimacy of constitutional procedure to hollow out constitutionalism, and deploying the language of national unity to justify the brutal suppression of dissent. He had not done it alone. He had been helped at every stage by people and institutions that made choices they would come to regret, or that were so corrupted by ideology or ambition that regret was no longer possible for them. The story of how it happened is not a comfortable story, but it is an essential one, and the world's failure to stop it, and its eventual catastrophic failure to stop what followed, remains the defining warning of our era. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that it gave you a deeper understanding of one of history's most consequential political transformations. If you enjoyed learning about how Hitler consolidated his power in 1933 and 1934, make sure to check out our other videos on the key figures of the Third Reich, the events of World War II, and the fates of those who served, survived, and suffered through one of history's darkest chapters. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. We'll see you in the next one.